Hi, Mark Pearson, Executive and Artistic Director of the College Light Opera Company, coming to you from the front porch of Highfield Hall. Welcome to On the Clock, our weekly lecture series. On the Clock is made possible through our partnership with Highfield Hall and a generous gift from the Woods Hole Foundation. This week, Miles Plant is going to be talking to us about the works of Stephen Sondheim. Let's hear what he has to say.
Hi everybody, my name is Miles Plant and thank you for coming to this week's On the Clock, in which I will be talking about Stephen Sondheim's Pacific Overtures, which opened on January 11th, 1976 to mixed reviews. There really had never been a show like it before that attempted to integrate aspects of Japanese kabuki theater and American Broadway show, and this is going to be the basis for our discussion today. A little bit about me. I graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire in 2015 with degrees in piano performance, music theory, and music history. And this lecture is based upon my undergraduate thesis in music theory. And I hope you enjoy it. So one of the major aspirations of American musical theater has been integration, where all aspects of the production, costuming, lighting, dialogue, choreography, music, etc., all contribute to the progression of the narrative as a whole. Stephen Sondheim, a composer of American musical theater, has taken great strides within his musicals to further the progression of drama and psychology through the narratives, as was taught to him through his mentor, Oscar Hammerstein II. His meticulous attention to musical detail is one of the vehicles in which Sondheim is able to push narratives forward and symbolize psychological, social, and ideological cultural change in his musical Pacific Overtures. So let's start with a little historical background first. The Japanese isolationist foreign policy of Sakoku, or closed country, began with policies introduced in the Edo period of Japan between 1633 and 1639. Under Sakoku, nearly all Japanese people were not permitted to leave, and similarly, foreigners were forbidden from entering Japan. Because of this policy, trade and relations between Japan and other countries was severely limited. This period lasted for nearly 214 years. In 1852, Commodore Matthew Perry was sent over to Japan in order to form trade relations with America. He arrived in Edo, modern-day Tokyo, in 1853 and was met by representatives of the Tokugawa shogunate, the governmental enforcers of Sakoku, who told him to go on to Nagasaki for negotiations. Instead of listening to them, Perry stormed past Japanese lines and pointed his cannons towards Edo. He proclaimed that if representatives did not meet with him, he would destroy the city. Peacefully, the Japanese took the treaty written by President Millard Fillmore. Perry said that he would return, and when he did, the Japanese agreed to virtually every term that President Fillmore had set, thus opening up trade to America. Britain got word of this and also demanded ports for trade. Holland, Russia, and France then followed suit. Once the Tokugawa shogunate was disbanded, the Emperor Meiji took complete charge of the country. While in his rule, the country went over a complete cultural, political, and economic reform which is now known as the Meiji Reformation, which lasted from 1868 until 1912. During this time, Emperor Meiji was determined to cast aside feudal forms and exchange them for a more quote-unquote enlightened way of living. This was the factual story that the writers of Pacific Overtures based their narrative on. So, in order for us to understand exactly how Sondheim pushes this narrative forward through music, we have to know how this story works within the musical itself. So here's a brief summary of the musical with the songs that we'll be discussing in their order. While following the friendship of two Japanese men, the musical interweaves a political backdrop recanting the way Japan was forcefully opened up for trade by the American government after a 214-year period of isolation. Pacific Overtures begins its journey in 1853. The reciter tells the audience that elsewhere, wars are fought and machines are rumbling, but in Japan they plant rice, exchange bows, and enjoy peace and serenity in the advantages of floating in the middle of the sea. The troubles begin with the appearance of Manjiro, a fisherman who is lost at sea and rescued by Americans. He returns to Japan and attempts to warn the lore of the presence of foreign warships in the waters around Okinawa, but is instead arrested for consorting with foreigners. A minor samurai, Kayama, is appointed prefect of police at Uraga to drive the Americans away, because they are not allowed to set foot on Japanese soil, according to Sakoku. This news leaves Kayama's wife grief-stricken, since it will result in certain failure and shame, but he assures her that there is no other way to move forward. He has to do his job. Men and women panic as they see 4 black dragons, the foreign warships, in the bay. Kayama enlists the aid of Manjiro, the only man in Japan who has dealt with these Americans. Disguised as a great lord, Manjiro, the fisherman, gets an answer from the foreigners. Commodore Perry announces that he must meet with the shogun in 6 days, or else he will shell the city. The shogun refuses to meet with the foreigners according to the old law. Exasperated by the shogun's indecision, his mother poisons him with chrysanthemum tea. With the shogun dead, Kayama devises a plan by which the Americans can set foot on Japanese soil, which is by covering the ground with tatami mats and through a raised treaty house. While Manjiro and Kayama travel to Okinawa, they create poems to pass the time. A madam reacts to the Americans' arrival by teaching her courtesans how to welcome the foreigners to Kanagawa. It seems Kayama has saved Japan, but it is too late to save Kayama's wife. He returns home to find her dead from seppuku, by stabbing herself in the stomach. Commodore Perry and his men come ashore and on their march to the treaty house demonstrate their goodwill by offering such gifts as 2 bags of Irish potatoes and a copy of Owen's Geology of Minnesota. It seems that Kayama has won. The Americans depart in peace. Japanese men then discuss what happened in the treaty house while someone was observing in a tree. The child emperor reacts with pleasure to the departure of the Americans, promoting Kayama to governor of Uraga and Manjiro to the rank of samurai. That is the end of Act 1. Act 2. The crisis appears to have passed, but to the surprise of the Japanese, the Americans return to request formal trading agreements. To the tune of a Sousa-esque march, they bid Japan please hello and are followed by a Gilbert and Sullivan British admiral, a clog-dancing Dutch admiral, a gloomy Russian, and a dandified Frenchman, all vying for access to Japan's markets. The years pass as Kayama and Manjiro dress themselves for tea. As Manjiro continues to dress with painstaking slowness into ceremonial robes for the tea ritual, Kayama slowly adopts the manners and dress of the newcomers, proudly displaying his new pocket watch, cutaway coat, and a bowler hat. But there are other less pleasant changes prompted by the presence of foreign influence. 3 British sailors mistake a pretty lady for a geisha. Though their approach is initially gentle, they grow ever more persistent to the point where they offer her money. The girl cries for help, and her father kills one of the confused tars. Reporting on the situation to the shogun, Kayama witnesses a murder by a cloaked assassin, and himself is killed by one of their number, his former friend, Manjiro. In the ensuing turmoil, the puppet emperor seizes real power and vows that Japan will modernize itself. As the country moves from one innovation to the next, the imperial robes are removed from the emperor layer by layer to show contemporary Japan, the world of Toyota and Seiko, air pollution and contaminated beaches. The reciter says, "There was a time when foreigners were not welcome here, but that was long ago. Welcome to Japan." So before we go forward, I want to clarify some terms as I'm going to define them so that we can all be on the same page when discussing the theory of music. The first is Western tonal harmony, and I consider that music and its theory as it has progressed in Western cultures. What is harmony, you might ask? It's the combination of notes to produce chords and chord progressions, and you only need 2 notes to create a harmony, which might sound like this. That's a harmony. It could sound like this, and it could sound like this. And remember those sounds, because we're going to be talking about those today. Intervals are the space between two notes. So we define that as a space. That happens to be a third. This is a fourth. And that is a fifth. Triadic. Harmony which uses the interval of thirds to construct chords. So that interval that I played there, we're going to actually add another third on top of that. And that's going to sound very pleasing to our Western ears. That's triadic writing, chords made of thirds. A scale is a set of musical notes in order of their pitch between an octave. In Western tonal harmony, we primarily use heptatonic or 7-note scales, so you probably know this. And in that scale, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different notes before we reach the same note again. And the distance, an octave, is an interval between two of those similar sounding notes. Tonic is the first note of a scale and the home base of harmony, what we might know as do. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. That's our home base, our tonic, our do. A key center is just another word for the tonic or tonal center of a section of a piece. But this is not always, this is why I call it home base, this is not always functional, what we would say Western tonal traditional harmony. So a key center is just our home base, that tonic, that root. A leading tone is the 7th degree of a scale that leads up to tonic. So do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, that's the 7th, do, and it leads up. If I were to play this, you would want me to finish it by completing it, right? It leads up to do. A mode. A mode is just a word for a type of scale. The order of intervals that create a type of scale. So for example, we have this scale, which you're all very familiar with, but this is also a type of scale. And this is a type of scale, right? But what we're going to examine particularly is this mode. It's this sound. It's just a type of scale. A pitch collection. It is exactly as it sounds. It's a collection of pitches that we are going to examine, and they're indicated in parentheses in these slides, that have an implied harmony or key center. They basically show us what the harmony or what the scale is within that piece of music that we're going to examine. Diatonic. All that term means is it relates to the key center. So all of those notes relate to a key center. I would say that they are diatonic. A cadence is a melodic and harmonic resolution which creates some sense of finality or pause. And in the West, we are very familiar with this cadence. It creates the sense of finality. A dominant to tonic cadence is exactly what I just played. It is, and for arc purposes, it is the most fundamental and traditional cadence in Western harmony. And if you want to go one step further, in that scale, if we were to give them numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we build a chord, that first chord that I played, based on that 5, and then we go to 1. And that creates a sense, it's a cadence that creates a sense of finality. I call that dominant to tonic motion, which is the most fundamental and traditional cadence in Western harmony. An imperfect authentic cadence is a cadence with that dominant to tonic motion in which the topmost note does not end on tonic, and if we wanted to be specific, does not have this leading tone, that ti, do. So, for example, an example of an imperfect authentic cadence, it'll still sound final, it's just not quite as strong. So I'm going to play what we would call a perfect authentic cadence, that dominant tonic cadence. And here's the imperfect authentic cadence. Notice you're not going to hear T do in the topmost voice. So, now that we know those terms, how does Sondheim push drama forward in this musical? Well, as the show progresses, Stephen Sondheim replaces appropriated elements of Japanese music with elements of Western tonal harmony to showcase the westernization of Japan that happens through the drama of the show. So that is my thesis, and that's what we are going to examine. Great. So in order to understand the westernization that takes place within the narrative, we must first examine what appropriated Japanese musical elements Sondheim uses towards the beginning of the show to establish the character of an isolated, quote-unquote, isolated Japan, free from foreign interaction. Japanese musical techniques that Sondheim cites himself for appropriating include instrumentation and imitation of that Japanese instrumentation, pentatonic or 5-note scales. Remember that in the West we use 7 notes, heptatonic. So, pentatonic scales. Avoidance of triadic writing in favor of fourths and fifths. So, for example, that's triadic. Here's fourth. What we will find out is called quartal writing. Sounds very different. And here's quintal writing. Those sound very, very different than this, that triadic writing. Non-resolving melodic closure, non-resolving harmonic cadences, and avoidance of the leading tone. And we'll go over what those mean in a little bit. But to start, the first Japanese technique that Sondheim and his orchestrator, Jonathan Tunick, use is through the literal use of Japanese instruments. And this primarily comes in the form of the traditional kabuki stage band, which would include woodblock, taiko drum, shakuhachi flute, and shamisen. And you can see in this picture on the screen, the middle character is holding the shamisen, which is a plucked instrument. And on the right-hand side, we see a player with the shakuhachi flute in hand, along with other percussion instruments. In traditional kabuki theater, these are seen right before the show and are used to get the audience and actors ready for a good show. They also will interject according to what's going on stage throughout the drama, throughout the narrative in traditional kabuki theater. Usually, these interjections come in when there is a dramatic turn of events. There are also other instrumental adaptations used in the musical, such as imitating the instrument of the show. The show is a wind instrument that consists of many bamboo pipes, and when played, it creates a multitude of notes in clusters, but also can create harmonies that are more open, that create that fourth and fifth sound, and I'm going to show you. It's a really beautiful, fascinating instrument. For our purposes, the importance of this instrument and the way that Sondheim uses it at the beginning of the show to establish this Japanese, this isolated Japanese setting is because the show is used in courtly music for the king. And you can see that this is actually, he uses this almost directly for that manner, that narrative function. And now listen, all of the instruments that are being played here are Western instruments, but they're specifically meant to imitate the show.
First for the Emperor, descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu, all-knowing and all-powerful, ruler absolute. 1 year old.
So here we see a direct correlation between the cluster chords of the show and that courtly manner in which it's presented. And that's important to establish the setting of an isolated Japan. Now, there is no Japanese scale, but there are hundreds of Japanese modes, however. These modes are typified with 5 notes, what we in the West would call pentatonic scales. Sondheim uses these as the basis for much of the musical. For example, in the first number of the show, The Advantages of Floating in the Middle of the Sea, the first chord that we see has a pitch collection of E, F sharp, A, and B. And that sounds like this. In totality, we are only using 4 different notes. When the melody line comes in, the pitch that added is C natural, completing a 5-note scale with the key center being E. So we see that harmonically and melodically, we are using 5 notes. And in entirety, only 5 notes. Similarly, in the second song of the musical, There Is No Other Way, it relies almost completely on one 5-note scale for its melody, the E minor pentatonic scale, which sounds like this. And you can see that repeated D in the bass denotes a bell plate, which has an indefinite pitch and therefore is not necessarily part of the tonic. It's not the tonic, it's truly E minor pentatonic. And to hear that, it sounds like this. So one of the appropriated 5-note scales that Sondheim uses often in the show is based on the Japanese mode, the In mode. And that sounds like this. That's that scale on the left. This mode is similar in sound to the Western tonal mode Phrygian, because it has a half step, an interval of a half step, in between the first 2 notes, and also a flatted 6th, which is in the In mode, that's that 5th note, and in the Phrygian mode, it's that 6th note. And here's the Phrygian mode, sorry. And here's the In mode, just to hear how similar they sound. Again, one is heptatonic and one is pentatonic. Sondheim, however, when he's using this mode, will add notes for color. And this can be seen within the first act, towards the beginning of the show, in this prayers underscore. It uses all of those notes in the In mode, that E, the F natural, the A, the B, the C natural, and the E, except for that F sharp, which Sondheim adds for color. That sounds like this. I'm sorry. And that creates that distinctive sound. Another way in which Sondheim creates this landscape is through the avoidance of triadic writing, this type of writing. Sondheim emphasizes what we in the West would call open intervals, such as fourths and fifths. That's a fourth, and that has a fifth. It just, when I say open, it's wider than a third. Harmonically, this emphasis is called quartal harmony, chords that are based on the interval of fourths, and quintal harmony, chords based on the intervals of fifths. And by using this melodic and harmonic construction, Sondheim avoids the emphasis of triads, that kind of writing, which is the basis for Western tonal harmony, harmonic writing in the West. And we can see this in a multitude of examples. So this is from the fourth song of the show, Chrysanthemum Tea, and this is an example of quartal writing in the melody, or quartal harmony in the melody. And that sounds like this. Right? And I mean, even if we were to do thirds, it gives a completely different sound. This is triadic writing. Sondheim emphasizes open sound, open intervals. And here, the last song of Act 1, Someone in a Tree, we have, you can see in the melody line here, right here, and also this last chord, these stacked fifths. Right? And if we were to use triadic writing in this song, it would sound maybe something like this. Right? That's saying that we would be using Western tonal tradition. Melodically, Sondheim shows, this is another example, shows inconclusiveness of resolution, an appropriation of the Eastern attitude of the value of unending reflection, by ending on the fifth scale degree or another chord tone other than tonic. Now what I mean by fifth scale degree is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? It doesn't end on our home bass. And in traditional, the justification for this is that in traditional Japanese music, final melodies and harmonies are often left open or do not end on what you might call a home bass to keep a contemplative, open, and reflective nature to their music. So we can see this is There Is No Other Way, the second song of the show, that, and this key center or scale that we use is E minor pentatonic. So here's the tonic. This is like our home bass, right? And this is the melody on top of that. He ends on this fifth, right? To keep it open. And he could have easily done There Is No Other Way, which would give it some form of closure or finality. There is no other way, which would give it, again, some sort of closure or finality. But he purposefully avoids that in the writing itself. Harmonically, Sondheim adheres to this principle for much of the musical. He will end on a chord that is not diatonic, remember, relating to the key signature, or the key center, I'm sorry, or will end with notes that block the cadence from being purely Western tonal. So here, this is the first number of the show, The Advantages of Floating in the Middle of the Sea. And I can tell you right now that this piece is in D. It's actually in a mode called D pentatonic, which sounds, or I'm sorry, D Phrygian, which sounds like this. So there's our tonic, right? And Western tonal harmony would dictate if we wanted to make the sound really, really, really final, like give it a cadence in terms of cadential form, it would sound like this. Right? Or, right? That would give us this finality. But I'm examining these last two chords here. So I'm going to look at this chord, and then I'm going to look at this chord, right? This chord is going to be in conjunction with this chord to create a cadence, okay? So this is what this chord sounds like. And then here's the last chord. And even if I were to play the measure before it, it doesn't necessarily sound as strongly final as we could, as he wants it to be, right? He doesn't want it to be super final sounding because he's avoiding harmonic closure. And he does this by, we can see here, this is D, A, D, and G. Up here, this G blocks this chord from being like a tonal closure. Instead, he blocks it so you don't feel like this is a final cadence or that it doesn't have harmonic closure. In the ending of Four Black Dragons, Song 3, this is just a different way in which he avoids harmonic closure. We see that we have this 5-to-1 motion, right? From these last notes to here, this B flat to E flat. But you can see that harmonically, this song was actually in E minor. So here's E minor. There's our tonal center. It's our home bass. And this is what Sondheim decides to do. Right? This was That's where the key signature says that we should probably end. But again, Sondheim does not do that. He's distorting how the song will end harmonically. I should say that, and this is a clarification, Sondheim does not rely solely on pentatonic scales for his melody and harmony in its entirety, because he's attempting to synthesize or showcase the Western and appropriated Japanese elements. But here's how he achieves this drama, this pushing of drama forward within the musical. It's the frequency in which these appropriated Japanese elements disappear in favor of Western elements, and that's how Sondheim showcases this Westernization of Japan throughout the course of the musical. And that's the basis of our discussion. So, let's start. This is, as the musical progresses, more and more Japanese techniques diminish as Western influences appear. This corresponds to the increasing interaction with the Japanese characters, that the Japanese have with the Americans. For example, the prayers underscore and scene change music used in the beginning of the first act use the stage band, along with the pit orchestra, and the in Phrygian mode to evoke an appropriated Japanese landscape. This underscore occurs before Americans have arrived. Again, I'm going to play this for you. I'm going to try and play it right this time. So you can hear how that sounds. However, at the end of the first act, when the Americans have landed, the underscore is replaced by a solo piccolo playing an Admiral's March, which sound is distinctly Sousa-esque. This is cleverly hidden because in traditional kabuki theater, a shakuhachi flute would play this transition music. It'll interject at dramatic moments. But here the theatrical function stays the same, but the Western influence changes the instrumentation, thus showcasing this synthesis. Sondheim, in conjunction to theatrical Westernization, begins to use more and more Western scales as the show progresses. For example, we see a melodic and harmonic profile based on the 5-note scale. There is no 5-note E minor pentatonic scale. There is no other way. Song number 2 of the musical, when the Japanese have not yet interacted with the Americans. And then, again, this is the one that sounds like this. Missed the trill there. Yeah. But as we advance to song number 4, Chrysanthemum Tea, when the Americans have begun to interact with the Japanese, yet have not set foot on Japanese soil, Sondheim uses a Western scale, A Phrygian, with the addition of E flat. This is used because the in mode, that Phrygian sounding, the Phrygian-esque sounding Japanese mode, has a half step between the first 2 notes and that flatted 6th. And therefore we see that he's starting to showcase this slight Westernization prompted by this interaction with the Americans. So this sounds like this. By the end of Act 1, however, when the Japanese have interacted with these Americans and have made this treaty pact with America, we see E flat major, and it is a completely Western scale. It is this scale. Sorry, and that we can justify because here is the key signature for it, and we see all of the notes of E flat major in this song. So we have F, B flat, C, and E flat here. F, B flat, C, E flat, and we have G here, A flat, D, and E flat. We have all of the notes. Oh, I'm sorry, and C. there's all the notes. You can also see here, and this I'll make this point a little bit later, that in this there is triadic writing. We see these thirds here, and this is after we have interacted with the Americans. And it's with these new scales that Sondheim is able to transition from quartal, that chords based on fourths and chords based on fifths, quintal harmony, to triadic harmony in the melody. So up until song number 5, entitled Poems, the harmony in the melodic line has exhibited quartal and quintal harmony, as we saw in this quartal harmony in Chrysanthemum Tea. However, in song number 5, Poems, 2 Japanese men, one who has interacted with the Westerners and one who has not, are walking together. That's Manjiro and Kayama. Because one of the men has been influenced by his interaction with Westerners, the harmony of the melody begins to shift from quartal and quintal harmony to thirds for a brief moment. And you can see that right here. And if that were in fourths, it would sound like this. And if it were in fifths, it would sound like this. But instead, to showcase this slight westernization, this interaction, we get this triadic writing, the basis for Western harmonic writing. And we see this that further on in the musical, this is Act 2, when all of these admirals are coming, the Russian, the British, the American, the Dutch, and the French are all coming and singing. We see this triadic writing in the melody here. This is open score, but you can hear it nonetheless. And it's also because of these scales that Sondheim is able to transition from, at the beginning of the show, non-Western, non-tonic resolving cadences to non-traditional Western tonic resolving cadences. And finally, in Act 2, we have Western tonic, traditional Western cadences. So, at the beginning of the musical, we see in the first 2 songs of the musical, The Advantage is Floating in the Middle of the Sea, and There is No Other Way, we see that, yes, we do have this tonic emphasis, but it's completely obscured by this G, right? We don't get this sense of finality from it, in other words. The second song in the musical, There Is No Other Way, we don't even have a harmonic ending. There's no resolution by any means. But by the song number 3, we then see this shifting to tonic resolving cadences, but either ones that don't match the key signature or don't use traditional cadence forms that we would have here in the West. So, for example, this was the harmonic ending to Four Black Dragons, but here's our tonal center, right? It doesn't end there. And then the next song, Chrysanthemum Tea, we're going to examine here. We have 5-to-1 motion to F sharp, but the key signature implies F major and or D minor, and neither of those appear, right? And this would be our key signature. The 5th song, this is the song where the Japanese man, Manjiro, who has been influenced by Americans, is speaking to another Japanese man, Kayama, who is not. We start seeing this trend towards these non-traditional cadences. In other words, not 5-to-1, right? So this accompaniment here, we're gonna examine here, right here. Right? We actually end on tonic. This 3-flat key signature actually is implying the mode that the song is in. So it does have a G tonal center. This is G here. So we end on that. We start seeing this shifting towards tonic resolving cadences. And similarly, in the next song, Welcome to Kanagawa, the song ends on 1, but is not approached traditionally. And Sondheim does this because the madam is trying to adapt and train her ladies to please the foreigners, right? So this I'm going to examine here. Sorry, my piano's out of tune. Great. This is how it would sound maybe if it were approached traditionally, right? But it's purposefully not. But we're inching closer and closer towards more Western harmonies. In Someone in a Tree, the finale to Act 1, the song ends on tonic per se, D major, but it is distorted by these stacked fifths. Sondheim decides to do this because there are no Americans in the song, but rather it is retelling what happened at the treaty house through Japanese men. So this is how this resolution sounds. I'm starting right here. Right? And if we wanted to make that Western, more traditionally Western, it would be, right? But it's distorted through these stacked fifths. By Act 2, Sondheim begins to employ Western cadences. The first song, Please Hello, shows a traditional harmonic cadence with that donic to tonic motion, but this is because Westerners are singing the song, and I'm going to examine from here. Right? We see that we have this T-do, and that sounds final to Western ears. Right? The next song, A Bowler Hat, ends on tonic with dominant tonic motion, but Sondheim purposefully removes the third of the chord to leave it open. And he does this because the song is about a man, Kayama, who is becoming Westernized, a Japanese man, Kayama, who is becoming Westernized. And I'll start here. Here's our tonic. We're inching closer and closer. Finally, in Pretty Lady, we are given a triadic ending with dominant tonic motion. However, it is not a perfect authentic cadence, this kind of cadence that I showed you before, where T is going to Do, but rather an imperfect authentic cadence, where the third, where it does not end, the top note does not end on tonic. And that sounds like this. It's in a different key. That was starting here, going to here. The last song of the musical, Next, ends on tonic, but it is not part of a traditional cadence. And this is because this song is not part of the narrative that the musical has been following, but rather the song depicts Japan in 1976. It fast forwards. That has been westernized, but still retains aspects of its original culture. This is what accounts for the blend of Western and Japanese techniques in the song. So this last measure sounds like this. And we get like a sense of finality, but it's not in the traditional sense, where we could have done something like, it would sound like this, you know? But he purposely obscures that. In conclusion, Pacific Overtures is an incredibly ambitious work that blends appropriated Japanese musical techniques and Western techniques to create a unique theater-going experience. It is through the transformation of the in mode in Prayers Underscore into the Phrygian mode in Chrysanthemum Tea to the E-flat major mode in Someone in a Tree, the shifting from quartal and quintal harmonies in Chrysanthemum Tea to tertian or triadic harmony in Poems, and the shifting from non-Western, non-tonic resolving cadences to non-Western tonic resolving cadences to Western tonic resolving cadences seen throughout the whole musical, that Sondheim is able to showcase the Westernization of Japan through his music. Through the removal and adaptation of these musical and theatrical techniques, Sondheim and the other writers of Pacific Overtures were able to showcase the Westernization and adaptation that the Japanese people were forced to embrace in their history. And I just want you all to know that you can find a complete videotaped production of the original Broadway cast on YouTube. It's quite stunning. And thank you so much for joining me, and I hope that this was educational. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Thanks!
On the Clock is part of our larger series, Digital Clock. Digital Clock is made possible by a generous gift from Phil and Liz Gross. If you'd like to learn more about our programming or how you can become a supporter, visit us at collegelight.operacompany.com. And don't forget, the grounds of Highfield Hall are still open for visitors, and it's beautiful this time of year. Hope to see you again this time next week for another installment of On the Clock.